The teenage killers of Brianna Ghey were named at their sentencing this morning. The pair, previously known as Girl X and Boy Y, have now been named as Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe. They were both 15 when they murdered Brianna in February last year, stabbing her 28 times in the head, neck, chest and back after luring her into a park in Warrington. Courts can block the naming of children accused or found guilty of murder, attempted murder or manslaughter until they are 18. But following their conviction in December, the numerous media requests, the killers, who are both now 16, the judge then decided that they needed to be identified to understand how children could do something so dreadful. Do you think the judge made the right decision in this case, Nick?
100%.
In all cases, though?
No. Every case on its own merits, but in this case, in every case, the judge has a balancing exercise. He's got to consider the rights of the murderer, their right to privacy, and they've got to balance that with the freedom of expression in the press. Consider how old the defendants are, the two murderers, and he performs a balancing exercise. The reality in this case was that the two people had already been named on social media. It was already out there. They are now 16. It's clearly in the public interest for so many different reasons. And there can be no doubt, in my view, in this case, that it was the right decision. You don't want the wrong families being attacked. You don't want vigilante groups, the wrong people being accused. So we need to know who they are. The public need to understand what sort of people can commit this horrendous type of crime. They're 16 at the time. By the time they're 18, they would be named. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about quite a short period of time. They will be given, undoubtedly, new identities. So any concerns you have for their welfare, they will be protected. So I can't see really there's a downside. The downside is, well, you keep it quiet for 2 years. There's going to be speculation. People, as I say, know who they are. So the judge, in my view, has got it absolutely right. They will be looked after while they're detained. They're detained during Her Majesty's pleasure for the next 2 years. They then go into an adult institution. We can talk about sentencing later if you want to. But they will be looked after, and everyone knows who they are. And it's in a way in their own interest. It's in everyone's interest, I think. I can't see any benefit.
Well,
but I'm not suggesting that in every case they should be named. It depends on so many different criteria.
Well, I'm not sure it's in the interest of their family, for example, Georgie, who could be targeted now.
I know. Listen, I don't want to sound like I'm defending this horrendous crime or what they've done in any way, but I do think we've got a duty of care to the murderers. And I do think 16 is still really young. And I think, they could be really vulnerable to committing suicide, to having harassment whilst they're in jail. Just the nature of social media these days and the nature of, how these media storms play out. I think it could have real life impact on their friends and family who are ultimately innocent in this, this horrendous event that's taken place. And, they do have autism and ADHD, and I'm not saying that's any kind of excuse, but they are vulnerable, and they were 15 when this happened, I think, 2 years isn't a long time, but it's enough for a teenager to become a little bit more of an adult, to have some, a little bit more wherewithal to help them do the next thing. Ultimately, we want to rehabilitate them, and we need to sort of give them the best chance for that. And I think, not naming them at this point will help them.
OK, well, let's now bring in Christophe Casey, criminal barrister. Chris, now you wrote a book, Justice on Trial. You argue that children are never criminals. Why do you think that? And does that mean that you're against naming children who kill ever, even when they're 18?
Yeah, 100%. In fact, I would argue that children shouldn't be prosecuted as an adult in an adult court in the way that happened here. It's really a gross form of hypocrisy, and all we're doing effectively by this prosecution and then the subsequent naming and shaming is looking to vilify and humiliate children, often vulnerable children themselves who have either, as has been said, have some form of learning disability or other impairment or psychological damage that's been caused by some aspect of their life. And we hold them up for public vilification at an age when we don't allow them to legally drive a car or vote or vape or smoke or do all sorts of other things because we consider that they're not old enough or mature enough to make decisions around those things. And yet, for some reason or other, we consider from the age of 10 years old that children are old enough in this country to be treated as a full adult in a criminal court, given a life sentence, and eventually sent to an adult prison for something they did as a young child. It's completely wrong. It's abominable. I think it's immoral that we treat children in a civilized society in that way. And many other countries around the world do not. And in fact, the age of criminal responsibility at 10 is one of the youngest in the entire world. It's younger than Saudi Arabia. It's younger than Afghanistan. We have to be asking ourselves as a society, is this really what we want to be seen to be doing to children because they've committed an appalling and violent act? Or should we be looking at the underlying reasons and their welfare and also the long term for our society? How does any of this publicity help anyone? How does it help the victims and the victims' families? It doesn't. All it does is put a spotlight on two troubled and very damaged children who will be troubled and damaged for the rest of their lives. And I think it's absolutely appalling reflection on our justice system.
Interestingly, we have two criminal barristers on the panel. Now, that doesn't happen very often. So, Nick, what do you...
criminal solicitor.
Oh, criminal solicitor.
solicitor.
What's your thoughts then?
Well, it's interesting to hear what Chris says. I think Chris and I I agree that every case should be dealt with on its own merits. In this particular case, we both agree they've carried out a horrendous crime. There was a huge amount of premeditation that was involved in this crime. They've expressed desires of torture, inflicting pain, etc., etc. They were 15 when they committed it. They were perfectly well aware of what they were doing. And there has to be, with the rehabilitation, there has to be a punitive aspect to sentencing and a deterrent effect. And they have to face the consequences of their actions and to treat them just as victims.
Do you really think...
Just one second, Chris. Just because they might suffer from autism or some sort of other mild form of mental disorder, that doesn't justify in any way their conduct, and we can't make excuses for them. We have to protect society, and we're not left with any realistic alternatives. There comes an age, in 2 years' time, they'll be named formally. We already know who they are. In the custodial system, in the youth offenders institutions, everyone would know who they are and what they've done. So it's almost it's an academic exercise in any event. But I certainly think from their conduct, their age, the balancing exercise with the public interest, we're entitled to know who they are, and that should act as some form of deterrent to other people who are tempted to behave in this way, and take responsibility for their heinous crime.
Chris.
Well, the problem is that this idea of deterrence, particularly when it comes to deterring children, is a complete myth. The idea that there are 14 or 15-year-olds sitting around reading this on social media or watching this programme and thinking to themselves, well, I've seen they've been named and shamed, so I certainly won't go and do anything like that for the rest of my life. It completely misunderstands how a child's mind works. Children don't think rationally. They don't join things up in the way that adults generally do. They are deeply immature emotionally, psychologically. And that's why children have special protections in so many areas of life. And that's why we don't allow children to do dangerous things, because we know that they're not capable of making proper decisions. And if we accept that basic proposition that children are emotionally, psychologically, and intellectually immature, then we have to accept that with that comes a responsibility to treat them as children until their 18th birthday. And in my view, on their 18th birthday, they should take on all of the rights and responsibilities and liabilities in law that come with being an adult. But until Chris, that point, we should treat them as children, because that's what they are.
Can I ask you a question? What happens on somebody's 18th birthday that all of a sudden their brain is fully developed? So why wouldn't, if somebody was 17 and a half, for example, and committed these sorts of crimes, you're still going to treat them as a child, never name them, keep their anonymity because they weren't mentally capable of making the distinction between right and wrong. And yet when somebody's 18 and a half, you're going to say, well, they definitely had the capabilities and they should feel the full force of the law. It's hard to just put one age on that then, isn't it?
It is, and I agree with you. And the science actually is very much in favour of your point, which is that when it comes to young men in particular, they don't reach a level of intellectual and emotional and psychological maturity that could genuinely be called adult in the full sense of the word until their mid-20s in many cases. So you make a very good point that 18 is an arbitrary age, but 18 is the age that we have chosen as a society to make the age of majority, the age at which people take on adult responsibilities. That's why we have, you can't say, well, we're going to test everybody everybody to see whether they're capable of voting. And some people can't vote until they're 30 because they're immature. You have to pick an age. And we picked 18 as the age of adulthood that marks adulthood. And for me, that should be the age. Of course, if someone actually is emotionally or psychologically immature in their 20s, then they too should be given the benefit of treatment and assistance rather than vilification and prosecution.
But that's going down
long period.
But that's going down the train of thought then, that Chris, that if you've got a criminal at the age of 24, we're not going to convict them because actually their brain might not be fully developed. But I mean, maybe this is something that we need to look into.
We do have to decide on an age, and I think, Chris's point is that age has been decided as 18. These kids were 15 when they did it. They're 16 now. That's still really, really young.
I read today,
those 2 years, they make a big difference in the development and their ability to be able to cope with what's going to be coming their way.
Have you looked at them? Have you seen their faces? Because to describe them, I know they're 16 now. They don't really look like the sort of children that you would imagine a child who doesn't know what they've done.
Hold on, I don't think we can start judging things on a picture.
But they don't look. When you talk about children, you imagine, innocence. There you go. These are children.
See, to me, that looks really young. I think they both look very young there.
OK, I want to get to some calls now. Lindsay from Sheffield, what's your thoughts on this? Should all children who kill be named?
Hello, love. Yeah, I think they should, to be quite honest. If they are mature enough to do something like that.
But the point is, Lindsay, it might be their immaturity.
No, that's what I mean. But in this case, where it was obviously premeditated, then they're old enough to be named. If it was manslaughter, it was an accident, then that's a different case.
Is it possible?
The fact that
Is it possible, Lindsay, to be immature in your premeditation of something?
Well, that's what I'm saying, though. Every case is different and it would have to be looked into. But if they said, right, you knew what you were doing, you planned this, you figured it out, and you still went through it, even though you knew what the consequences would be, then yeah, name them, shame them.
So you're saying in this instance, but everything in a case-by-case basis, Lindsay?
Yeah. And you can't just say, well, that person's not reached 18 yet, so they can get away with it. It's got to be an individual situation for each case. But if it's proved they knew what they were doing, they knew what the consequences were, then yes, they have to face those consequences.
Chris, you were shaking your head there.
Well, I'm shaking my head because I think the problem is partly, as Nick suggested, this idea that you look at somebody and somehow you can judge what's underneath in terms of their emotional maturity or their psychological condition just from a photograph. I mean, I doubt if Nick really believes that to be the case. Not
by itself, Chris, but in conjunction with the premeditation, the planning that went into this, the weapons, the damage that's been inflicted. It's part of it. It's a piece of a jigsaw that I think the judge has considered and got the balance right in this case. And I'm not suggesting that in every case, but in this case, the judge has got it right.
But that's a totally different argument. That you're asking whether this judge in this case has applied the law as it now stands correctly. Well, I agree that broadly speaking, she probably did. But that I'm saying the law is wrong and that we should actually be looking at a system where at the age of 18, and just to be absolutely clear about this, if a young person, whatever their age, I mean, they could be 7 or 8, if a young person is physically dangerous to others, then we have a duty, of course, to protect others. And that means a secure home environment or a secure school or secure educational environment. But it should not be a custodial punitive environment for children, because fundamentally, in my view, children don't belong in prison. And you, Nick, I'm sure in your earlier career, like me, been to young offenders institutions, they're basically prisons. And we're putting children as young as 12 years old into prisons with cells and bars and all the other things that go with it. And there's something deeply, deeply wrong with a society, in my view, that does that to children. And in this case, look at the psychological background. This young woman in particular appears to have succumbed to psychological influence and trauma during lockdown in 2020, when she was obsessively watching nothing but horror movies and becoming fixated on horror movies and knives and killing at the age of 12 at the time. So deep psychological damage done. 1 in a million children it might happen to, but when it does, they're still children, and let's treat them like children, but protect the public at the same time.
Can I just say
the thing is, it's very rare for people to ever do this for a second time.
Nick, very quickly.
I think children grow up much more quickly now because of the internet, because of the knowledge and information available. Actually, whereas before they might have been younger children, I think children now 15 and 16 are actually much more mature because they're furnished with a much greater degree of knowledge.
Stephanie from Powys, what do you think should all... Sorry, Chris, I just want to get more viewers' calls in. Stephanie from Powys, you're up next. Do you think that all children should be named who have killed?
Not all children. I think it's case by case, just as Nick has been saying. Most of the arguments that I was going to suggest have all been said, so I won't repeat them. But I think sometimes you have to look at the background of these children. I'm afraid they probably come from disturbed homes.
Well, Stephanie, I'm just going to stop you there on this point. We have been told, and the information we have given is that they come from, and I'm quoting here because I'm uncomfortable with the word, but normal backgrounds, whatever you choose to believe that is.
Well, they do. They come. Well, if they do, well, then it's very sad that the families don't realise that these two children are disturbed. And I think they are disturbed. But I think it's quite right that they're named. For heaven's sake, they may have been 15 when they did this, but they knew exactly what they were up to.
Well, Chris would say that they don't necessarily know exactly what they're up to.
Well, that's his argument. That's his argument. My argument is the other way. And I wish more judges had the courage to do this in future, because it might stop other young people saying, oh, my goodness me, I'm going to be named on television and everything for what I've done. I don't want to get involved.
Do you think that would put somebody off? I mean, if you're making the...
I don't know. I don't know, because the trouble is they're so heavily influenced now by social media, terribly influenced by social media. And I believe these two were they felt very... cut off during COVID, and therefore they watch some horrible things, and they all watch horrible things. And, this does have an influence on people, very, very sadly.
Can I just ask, Chris, what do you think the sentencing might be in this case? I mean, we're going to get the sentencing later today. I mean, it's imminent.
Well, obviously, ultimately it's a matter for the judge, but I would expect the minimum term to be set at probably around 15 years, which means that the judge has to take account of a whole range of factors. But what she does, because this is an indefinite sentence or equivalent of a life sentence if they were adults, the judge only sets a minimum term before they can apply for parole. And I would expect that to be somewhere in the region of 15 years for children of this age. But that means that they won't even be able to apply for parole until they're in their 30s. And you just think about the difference between a 15-year-old and a 30-year-old. They'll have spent at least 12 years in adult prisons. And that, to me, is a complete and utter travesty. We're spending hundreds and hundreds. We could have sent 6 children to Eton for their whole childhoods instead of the money that we're going to spend putting these 2 children in prison for that length of time.
Not sure that's where you'd want to put the money, but I get
Chris,
your point.
I think the starting point...
That's the amount of money we spend.
I take your point.
The starting point's 12 years, and there are aggravating features here: the premeditation, the fascination with torture and violence, the weapons used, and of course the fact that the deceased is a transgender girl. They will aggravate it. So the judge starts at 12 and builds it up. And I think that they will serve at least 15, possibly 18 years in custody. And I think that's what they deserve. I think they have to take responsibility for this appalling crime. OK, stay with us, because we're going to take more calls on this after the break.
Yeah, hello. I don't think they should have been named. They have a mental illness, which your defence lawyer was very flippant about and didn't understand anything about.
I don't know if there's a mental illness involved. What mental illness are you...
Well, they said they had autism and had ADHD, which are
neurodivergent. I'm not sure we would class them as a mental illness, but I take your point. There's neurodivergency there.
Well, I'm ADHD and I have to see a mental health nurse, so I would class that as a mental illness.
Okay.
I also have to do things. I don't understand that your decision making with the disease is actually impaired quite drastically. I do even now do silly stuff and regret it afterwards. Nothing too bad, but I do think, why do I do that? So these
Andrew,
shouldn't have been named.
But generally, you would say you would understand right from wrong?
I do understand right from wrong, but sometimes I make bad decisions, nothing law-breaking, but I make very bad decisions on the spur of the minute because your decision-making capacity is very limited. We're very rash and we make very silly decisions and regret them later.
Andrew, your mental capacity is not on trial here.
Andrew,
These two defendants have been tried and they've been convicted, which means they've been found to have sufficient mental capacity to commit and be convicted of murder. So what you're saying isn't the issue in this case.
Debatable. If they were, that's the opinion of the judge, and I respect that.
The jury.
But yeah, and the jury, and the jury side, I respect that. But I also know how debilitating the disease can be, and they need supporting and not putting down, and naming them doesn't really do anything. You can say that as much as you want.
Andrew,
but for me, it doesn't do anything.
You make an interesting point. It's a point Georgie brought up earlier that I'm going to put to Nick again. Who does this actually benefit? If we name these children, these criminals, these murderers,
Yep.
Who is that benefiting?
It benefits the public. The public have a right to know. The media have a right to know. But
Why?
it also because it stops people falsely accusing. If there's certainty, if we know who they are, we're not going to have vigilante groups picking out wrong families, terrorising wrong families, because they'll know who these people are.
That doesn't ring true with your social media argument, which you say those names are already out there on social media.
They are, and the fact they've been named means that the public now know exactly who it is, so that we know quite confidently that
But what it does is it creates more of a media storm around two people who are vulnerable, who, do have mental health. I mean, what they've done is horrendous, and they will be punished for those crimes, and they deserve that.
This is part of the punishment.
And I think that's the wrong way of looking at it, because you're we don't have a right to sort of add to their misery.
We're making them take responsibility. We're naming the elephant in the room and saying, you've done this.
They're really young.
Yes, they are young, but they're old enough to commit the most heinous crime you could ever imagine. And it's right that they take responsibility for it. And it's right that other families who might have been accused who live in the area are now going to be safe. And the families...
I just don't think that argument rings true with the fact that you say that it's public knowledge. So,
well, it is public.
I don't think it
can
both be... No, I know, but before that...
Well,
so
it's
you
now...
said the names are out there on social media.
Yeah.
So I think everybody in the local area would know who those people were, because, news would spread.
But their safety isn't confined to people within the area. You have people, as we've had recently, travelling long distances to conduct their own vigilante behaviour. So I think certainty is a good thing.
I'm going to go back to the calls. Chris, I can see you're exasperated by those comments. I'm going to come to you in a minute. Gina from Swansea, what's your thoughts on this?
Well, I'd like to ask the person that you have on video link.
Yep, Chris.
It's a personal question. Has he got kids? Had they been murdered by these two people? What would then his thoughts be?
If it was a personal situation. So I'm presuming, Gina, that you feel like we're thinking too much about the criminals and we're not thinking about Brianna's parents. And actually, that might be an argument, Chris.
Is the question, do I have children, and if so, have any of them been murdered? The answer is yes, I do, and no, none of them have been murdered. But that's the exact reason why people who are the victims or the families of victims shouldn't be involved in the decision making. Because if you are the victim of the crime, if you have lost your own child in a case like this, clearly you are not going to, your entire view is going to be driven by your own emotion and anger and resentment and sense of revenge and punishment and all of these sentiments, which frankly don't have a proper place in the justice system.
But Chris,
they are understandable emotions, but they have no place in our justice system.
Chris, there is a criticism of the judicial system that actually we spend too much time thinking about the rights of the criminals and not enough time thinking about the rights and the feelings of the victims, and maybe that is where our focus should be going now.
And what about victim impact statements, Chris? That's an integral part of our judicial system now. Are you saying that should be?
It is.
Are you saying that shouldn't be there?
There are two separate things. There are two completely separate things. One is the right of victims to be heard, to make their views known, to express themselves through the victim impact process to the court. The other is the judge's decision to apply the law to sentencing. And those two things are very separate. The purpose of the victim impact process is not because somehow if you've got a more eloquent victim's father or mother, that the sentence should be higher than in a case where the victim's parents choose not to make a statement, because the judge has to look at the crime itself. Yeah. They have to look at all of the various factors, including the age and the maturity levels of the individual defendants.
And the impact.
And the impact. You can't have victim-based justice. That's what we had thousands of years ago, an eye for an eye. That was the idea behind Old Testament justice.
It isn't exclusively, but Chris, it isn't
on the outcomes,
Chris,
protecting the public.
It isn't exclusively that, but the impact statement and the impact on the families of the deceased, the family of the deceased, it is an integral part, and it's right that the judge takes that into account when sentencing.
How is it right? It isn't right, because what the crime itself is not made worse because it has a greater impact on some families than others.
It may be.
Ridiculous. We can't have a sentence that if someone's been more hurt and more harmed by their child being murdered than somebody else, that they get a heavier sentence. It doesn't make any sense.
OK, I'm going to go back to calls. Gina, I hope that answered your question. Andrew from London, should all children who kill be named?
Absolutely. And I've been listening to the panel talk, and I've heard the rhetoric about horrendous crime, and it's but she suffered. That was a terrible trauma. It was terrifying for her, that ordeal, the young girl that got killed, and nobody's speaking up for her. And I know people say flippantly, oh, yes, well, it was awful and whatever, but it would have been horrific. And the other thing I'd like to say is that by naming people, you're including the general population, because I think the legal system is becoming more and more removed.
What do you clarify what you mean by that, Andrew? I don't understand the statement that by naming them you're including the rest of the population.
Because the legal system is becoming removed from the general public. So most people are too simple to understand how the legal system works, so we're not included. And we could see how the families were not included in the 3 stabbings.
OK, I can understand your objection to not having the families included in this court case and the parents of Brianna, if you feel like they weren't included enough in it. But I don't understand why the general population should be included in what is for the courts.
Because we're all part of one community. So if something like that happens, we need to know who would do that.
Well, Andrew, it's an interesting point you make, but I don't know whether it's an argument for or against naming. Chris, what do you think? We could get vigilantism if we all went by Andrew's books.
Well, I think there's a couple of really good points that are being made here about the lack of understanding of how the process and the decision-making works, including in the Nottingham case last week, which of course was big news, and in this case as well. There is a sense among members of the public, and I do a lot of interviews and listen to a lot of comments about these things, that somehow the judicial system has gone soft and that judges are all soft and they bend over backwards to help the criminals, in inverted commas. The truth is, in the 30 years that I've been a criminal lawyer, the length of sentence for violent crimes has doubled. People spend twice as long in prison as they did in the 90s for murder and serious sexual violence. And most people think it's the other way round. And so we're clearly failing as professionals, judges, and as the legal system in general to explain to the public that actually the direction of travel has been in favour of longer and longer sentences, and our prison population is bigger than ever. It's almost 85,000. Prisons are bursting at the seams. So it's the exact opposite. What we're doing is locking up too many people for too long. And the impact is greater criminality in our society.
Andrew, thank you for your call. Coralie from Wiltshire, what's your thoughts? All children who kill to be named, is that, should it be a case-by-case basis?
I think it should be a case-by-case basis. You can go back to the early 90s with Jamie Bolger. He was abducted, the kids planned it. If children have planned these murders, then yes, they should be named. If it's a fit of anger or spur of the moment, then no.
Isn't it important as a society we have open justice? That was one of the reasons that the judge erred on.
I think this is, you've got to think that we do still need to think about the fact that we're having to look after, in Jamie Bolger's case, they were, 10 years old?
Yeah.
So would you not have named them then?
No, I don't think... I don't know how naming them in that circumstance actually helped the public's knowledge about, them. I don't see how that aided them. I just see how that maybe was detrimental.
Just talking about the premeditation in this instance that Coralie brought up. So the defendant's murder plan was released in December. It's showing what the plan was. You can read that if you wish online. It is quite hideous. But when you read that sort of plan, Chris, it's hard to think that these individuals weren't mature enough to know what's right and wrong.
Well, I think the problem with that analysis is that right and wrong is a very simplistic concept. A child might know that they shouldn't put their hand in the fire, or that you don't, take your sister's food off their plate. They know the sort of binary rights and wrongs of very simple issues. But what you're describing here is a level of psychological kind of trauma and psychological mindset, which anybody thinking about it and looking at it would agree is entirely abnormal. It's an abnormal state of mind to get into. You just have to look at the document you put on screen. It looks like a child's homework book. These are children. And children should be nowhere near the criminal justice system, because the most important purpose of the criminal justice system is not to have open justice for its own sake, so that you can vilify, name and shame, as we're doing in this segment. The purpose of the criminal justice system is overall to reduce the amount of crime and stop future victims
and to protect the public.
And this does nothing to achieve that whatsoever. And if Nick thinks it does, tell us how. How is a single future murder prevented by the naming and shaming of these two children?
Well, it's not for the naming and shaming. That's not the real reason. It's to protect the public, so that the public know who's responsible. In my view, they forfeit the right for anonymity.
The vigilantes go to the right house. That seems to be the message.
So, Chris, what would you do then? What would you do with these people?
You would put them in a secure educational environment where they're not free to leave or walk around the streets, but the entire next 2 years of their childhood to be spent on rehabilitation until they are no longer a danger to the public. And actually, very, very few child killers remain dangerous in later life and remain violent in later life for the very reasons we've been talking about.
OK, I just want to jump in because I've only got about a minute left and I want to put another caller in. Sorry, Chris. Charlotte from London, what's your thoughts on this?
Oh, hi.
Hi, you did expect to be picked up.
Yes,
sorry, what do you think?
So, I think that we shouldn't be putting children's names out there, no matter what the circumstances are. And just something that Nick said about not saying who the children are, and then people's families online being terrorised who people think it might be. Mm-hmm. But so my thing is, then does that mean the actual children who have committed crimes, parents or families, should be terrorised? Because we have to remember, some of these children have siblings, and when those siblings go to school, they can be bullied. People may have to leave their areas.
Why should families be punished for the crimes of children?
That goes with the territory. If your children commit a heinous crime, unfortunately, you can't sort of cocoon yourself and say, I'm not going to bear any responsibility. I mean, I don't know about the families here, but we have been told that during lockdown, these children were watching lots of terrible videos. I'm sure they weren't.
But lots of children do lots of things without their parents' permission.
Well, we don't live in a perfect world, do we?
So, Charlotte, thank you very much for your call.